History usually begins with noise. Stone scraped into shape, names pressed into clay, lines drawn across land and declared permanent. We are taught to listen for those sounds when we search for the past, to trust what left weight behind. Pages turn, timelines advance, and civilizations appear as if summoned by architecture alone. And yet, between these solid markers, there is an enormous quiet. A long stretch of time where maps fade and explanations grow thin. It is here, in the wide spaces between chapters, that the earliest steppe societies exist, not introduced, not explained, simply passed over as though absence itself were proof that nothing important happened there. Their quiet presence lingers like a held breath, unnoticed only because we were trained to expect echoes instead of permanence always. Open any history book and the pattern repeats. Fields are planted, villages settle, walls rise. From these still foundations, power is allowed to grow. What moves, however, is rarely trusted. Nomadic life does not fit neatly into ledgers or borders, and so it is reduced, simplified, or ignored. Herds crossing grasslands leave no ruins to admire centuries later. Camps vanish with the seasons. Memory travels with people instead of resting in stone. Over time, this difference becomes distortion. Movement is mistaken for disorder. Flexibility is mislabeled as lack. A way of living that avoided permanence is quietly ranked beneath those that demanded it. This hierarchy feels natural only because the measuring tools were built to reward stillness and punish anything that refused to stay in one place long enough historically. The silence surrounding the steppe is often treated as neglect, but blame is too simple an answer. History does not intentionally erase, it filters. It preserves what can be fixed, catalogued, and revisited without movement. Writing freezes moments, borders freeze claims, buildings freeze intention. A society designed around motion resists all of these traps. Its choices dissolve after use. Its knowledge adapts instead of accumulating. When later historians searched for origins, they searched with tools that could not detect such lives. The absence they recorded was not emptiness, but incompatibility between the observer and the observed. The method itself shapes the story, narrowing vision until what cannot be held still appears to disappear entirely from understanding, without leaving obvious signs that anything valuable was ever present within those landscapes alone. Seen this way, silence becomes evidence rather than absent. The steppe was not empty space waiting to be filled by history. It was full of movement that history was never trained to follow. Generations rose and passed without anchoring themselves to monuments. Knowledge travelled in rhythm, not record. Decisions were made for seasons ahead, not centuries. To systems obsessed with accumulation, such lives appear thin, fleeting, incomplete. But thinness can also mean refinement. What survived on the steppe survived because it knew when to let go. Nothing remained long enough to fossilize, and that impermanence protected it. The absence of scars, often mistaken for weakness, was the result of careful balance, rather than failure or ignorance learned slowly through repetition, attention, restraint, and an unspoken understanding of limits over time. Recognizing this pattern changes how the story begins. If silence repeats across centuries and continents, it is no longer accidental, it becomes structural. The steppe was erased not by conquest, but by method. Not by fire, but by filing systems that could not process motion. Once this is seen, the questions shift. Instead of asking why nothing remains, we begin asking what kind of life leaves so little behind. And from there, the focus turns outward, away from books and toward the land itself. Because the next step is not to search for ruins, but to understand the stage on which these unheard lives moved. The grasslands wait beyond the margins, holding answers that only reveal themselves once silence is allowed to speak without interruption or hurried interpretation fully alone. The steppe appears first not as a place but as motion. From above, the land stretches without edges, an ocean of grass moving in slow waves beneath open sky. Wind replaces walls, distance replaces depth. Nothing here asks to be conquered or completed. The horizon never closes, and because of that, attention sharpens. The steppe is often described as harsh, but harshness implies hostility. This land is not hostile, it is precise. Every season arrives clearly. Every change announces itself early. Survival does not depend on force, but on noticing. Herds migrate along invisible lines drawn by memory and climate, not ownership. Water appears, disappears, returns. Fire clears old growth and feeds new life. Across these repeating movements, the land teaches rhythm. To live here is to listen constantly, to read subtle shifts in grass, cloud, and animal behavior. What seems empty to outsiders is filled with signals, and those who learn to read them are never lost. Because nothing stays fixed, permanence loses its value. Instead of walls, there are roots remembered through repetition. Instead of borders, there are shared understandings about timing and restraint. The people shaped by this land did not measure wealth in acres or monuments, but in relationships between places. Movement was not chaos, it was coordination across space. The open terrain rewarded foresight, rather than defense. To linger too long in one place was to exhaust it. To move too quickly was to miss opportunity. Balance mattered more than control. This environment cultivated patience and awareness rather than dominance. Children learned direction before ownership. Elders carried climate memory instead of written law. Decisions were shaped by seasons that would return, not projects meant to last forever. From this rhythm emerged a worldview that valued adaptability over accumulation. What could not move could not survive. What could move learned when to stop. The land did not demand obedience. It demanded attention, and in return it offered continuity without walls or cities. Over time, this way of seeing shaped how reality itself was understood. The steppe trained people to think in cycles rather than lines. Nothing truly ended. It shifted position, returned altered, then shifted again. Storms came back, herds returned. People moved outward and inward with the year. This encouraged memory without fixation. Stories were told not to preserve events, but to prepare listeners for patterns. Knowledge stayed light so it could travel. What mattered was not building something that lasted, but responding correctly when conditions changed. To an outside observer searching for ruins, this culture appears invisible. There are no stone statements of belief, no foundations to measure ambition. But invisibility was not a flaw. It was alignment with a land that punished excess and rewarded restraint. The grasslands did not allow mistakes to accumulate. They required constant recalibration. In this environment, awareness replaced architecture, and movement became the only structure that could endure. This is why the steppe feels absent in historical accounts. It did not announce itself in forms designed for permanence. It offered no easy evidence to archive, no clear beginning or end to record. Instead, it shaped people quietly, teaching them how to exist inside uncertainty without trying to dominate it. When historians later looked for origins, they searched for foundations rather than flows. They looked for walls instead of paths. What they missed was not failure, but intention. The land refused to stay still, and those who lived with it learned to move accordingly. To understand these societies, the gaze must shift away from objects and toward terrain. Before names, before borders, before chronicles, there was grass and sky and motion. This environment was not a backdrop, it was the teacher. And if the land shaped a way of living so different from everything written later, then the next question follows naturally. Who were the people who learned to read this vastness, to follow its rhythms, and to build lives that left almost nothing behind except continuity itself? The answer does not arrive yet, but it waits just beyond the horizon, where the land itself begins to explain what books never learned to ask and prepares the path toward the people shaped entirely by movement and endless seasonal return. From a distance, early steppe societies are often reduced to motion alone, as if they wandered without structure or intention. This image persists because conflict leaves louder evidence than balance. Yet daily life on the steppe was not chaos moving across grass, but a living system tuned through repetition and care. Families moved together along familiar routes, returning to the same seasonal grounds year after year. Decisions were made slowly, guided by memory shared across generations, rather than impulse. Children learned the land before they learned hierarchy. Elders were valued not for authority, but for recall. Survival depended less on force than on knowing when not to act. They built no cities because cities would have trapped them in place. Instead, knowledge became the architecture that held their world together. Weather patterns were remembered in stories. Animal behavior was read like language. Camps were designed to disappear, leaving grass time to recover and water sources unstrained. Even homes were liked by intention, assembled and taken apart without scouring the ground. The land was not conquered or owned. It was negotiated with, season by season, through restraint and timing. Because nothing permanent was created, nothing needed defending. Conflict was not absent, but it was limited by practicality. Violence disrupted movement, and disruption threatened survival. Cooperation, by contrast, extended reach. Information traveled faster than armies ever could. Oral memory connected distant groups without requiring centralized control. This flexibility made these societies difficult to classify later. They left no single capital to conquer, no archive to seize, no ruler whose name could summarize their identity. A quiet truth sits beneath this pattern. These societies did not fail to develop. They chose differently. Systems of domination, borders, and written authority were unnecessary when awareness governed behavior. What later civilizations called advancement required consolidation. The steppe required attunement. One accumulated, the other adjusted. When history later searched for progress, it looked for evidence of control rather than evidence of balance, and so it passed over what could not be easily ranked. This choice had consequences. Lives that leave few scars are easy to overwrite. Without records, later societies defined the steppe from the outside, simplifying it into threat or emptiness. The image of wandering warriors replaced the reality of careful stewards. Mobility became shorthand for primitiveness, not precision. Over time, the misunderstanding hardened, not because it was accurate, but because nothing visible contradicted it. What modern history labels as early or incomplete may instead represent a parallel sophistication. A way of living that avoided permanence was never designed to compete for prestige. It was designed to endure without demand for recognition. To systems that reward visibility, this looks like absence. In reality, it was presence without imprint. A culture that passed through landscapes gently enough to remain difficult to find. Understanding this reframes the entire idea of progress. Development does not always point toward buildings, borders, and permanence. Sometimes it moves sideways, choosing balance over expansion and continuity over accumulation. The steppe societies lived inside limits rather than pushing past them, and those limits sharpened awareness instead of suppressing it. Their success cannot be measured by ruins or empires, only by how long life continued without collapse. This is why they appear early and then seem to vanish, not because they disappeared, but because they declined to announce themselves to systems that only recognize solidity. With this perspective, the question is no longer why they are missing from history. It becomes why later civilizations misunderstood them so completely. To answer that, the story must now turn toward the observers themselves, toward the settled worlds that encountered motion and mistook it for threat, confusion, or lack. Only then does the deeper misunderstanding come into view. It is there that labels harden, judgments form, and silence transforms from lived choice into imposed absence, setting the stage for centuries of misreading and inherited assumptions, mistaken for truth forever. History was never written from open ground. It was written from within walls, by people who believed stability was not only desirable, but necessary for survival. Long before chronicles took shape, settled societies discovered that control depended on stillness. Writing required permanence. Taxation required fixed populations. Borders required land that stayed put long enough to be counted, divided, and defended. From this perspective, anything that moved freely existed outside the system, and what existed outside the system was, by definition, difficult to understand, and even harder to trust. Nomadic societies did not fit into these early frameworks. They crossed land without claiming it permanently. They shifted with seasons rather than calendars. They organized themselves through memory and custom, instead of written law. To states built on accumulation, this behavior appeared evasive. People who could not be reliably located could not be taxed. Communities that dissolved and reformed could not be easily ruled. Lives that left little behind could not be archived. Over time, inconvenience became interpretation. Mobility was recast as instability. Flexibility became unreliability. Adaptation was simplified into backwardness. Not because these labels described reality, but because they made governance easier. Early historians did not set out to misrepresent the steppe. They wrote from what they knew. Their world was defined by walls that separated inside from outside, citizen from stranger, order from uncertainty. From that vantage point, stillness felt like safety, and movement felt like threat. Descriptions of nomadic peoples reflect this mindset. Language hardened around fear and unfamiliarity. Groups were summarized rather than understood. Complexity was flattened into warning. Over generations, these summaries were repeated, cited, and taught until they felt neutral and factual, stripped of the anxiety that produced them. This process was quiet, not malicious. It did not require agreement or coordination. It unfolded naturally as history favored what could be recorded and dismissed what could not. What survived on paper was assumed to have mattered more than what survived through practice. The steppe did not challenge this framing, because it had no reason to. Its societies functioned without needing validation from archives. But silence does not stop interpretation. It invites projection. The less that was written, the more confidently others wrote in its place. Eventually, description became inheritance. Students learned a world where civilization advanced through settlement, and anything outside that arc appeared unfinished. Nomadic life was positioned as a stage to be passed through, not a system sustained by choice. The bias was no longer visible because it was embedded. History did not forget the steppe. It learned to see everything through structures that could not detect motion without mistaking it for disorder. Recognizing this reveals the first major shift in understanding. The absence of explanation is not an oversight. It is the outcome of tools designed for a particular way of living. Once this is seen, the narrative changes direction. The steppe was not invisible because it was small or insignificant. It was invisible because it did not reinforce the assumptions of those writing the story. History recorded what made sense within walls and blurred what moved beyond them. This realization does not accuse the past, it reframes it. Every system has limits, and those limits shape what appears meaningful. The steppe fell outside those boundaries, and so its logic was never fully translated. Instead, it was summarized into stereotypes that survived long after the original anxiety faded. With this understanding in place, the question sharpens. If history was written from within fortified spaces, what happened when people who lived without walls came into contact with those spaces directly? When movement reached the gates of permanence, misunderstanding was no longer theoretical. It became visible, tense, and recorded. And it is there, at that boundary, that the next part of the story unfolds. The steppe enters recorded history abruptly, and never gently. One moment it is background, barely mentioned. The next it appears as disruption. Armies are named, threats are declared. The tone shifts from indifference to alarm. What changed was not the land or the people, but the point of contact. When settled societies finally noticed movement at their edges, they interpreted it through fear. Seasonal migrations that had followed the same rhythms for generations were suddenly described as advances. The unfamiliar scale of motion felt intentional, directional, dangerous. To those living behind walls, movement without permission resembled attack, even when no battle had been planned or desired at all. Empires planned their futures in land deeds and inheritance. Fields passed from parent to child. Borders hardened across maps. Stability became proof of legitimacy. Steppe societies planned differently. Their timelines followed weather, animals, and shifting grass. Survival was measured year by year, not generation by generation. When drought or pressure altered familiar routes, movement increased. To a nomadic system, this was adjustment. To a settled system, it looked like escalation. The same action held opposite meanings depending on perspective. One side saw continuity. The other saw threat forming where none had existed before openly. Language did the rest. Descriptions tightened. Words like migration softened into invasion. Cooperation blurred into unpredictability. Oral agreements, flexible by design, appeared unreliable to states that depended on written permanence. What could not be documented could not be trusted. When movement coincided with strain along imperial borders, interpretation hardened into certainty. People who arrived without clear demands or permanent settlement confused systems built around declaration and ownership. Suspicion filled the gaps left by misunderstanding. Complexity collapsed into warning, because warning was easier to manage than uncertainty. Over time, this framing erased cause and highlighted consequence. Conflicts entered record without context. Violence was preserved. Pressure was forgotten. Many clashes attributed to sudden barbarian aggression followed years of expansion, land seizure, and restricted movement by settled powers. Grazing routes closed. Water access narrowed. Trade shifted under centralized control. Mobility was squeezed. The steppe did not erupt outward. It was compressed inward until adaptation collided with immovable borders. Reaction was recorded as initiation, response was archived as cause. The record kept the noise and discarded the pressure that produced it. This reframing unsettles because it requires no dramatic reversal, only patience. The evidence was always there, embedded in patterns that look different when viewed from open land instead of stone towers. Movement becomes legible as response rather than intent. Violence appears as last resort rather than defining trait. The steppe does not emerge as victim or villain, but as system responding to constraint imposed by incompatible logic. Neither side fully understood the other, but only one held the pen. Once this shift is noticed, the story changes tone. The familiar narrative of invasion loses certainty. Questions replace labels. If movement was misread as threat, what else was misunderstood? If conflict was reaction rather than origin, what qualities were never recorded because they did not clash loudly enough to be remembered? The steppe appears again not as force, but as presence forced into collision. And as the noise of battle fades, attention can finally turn inward, toward the quieter strengths that sustained these societies long before and long after their brief appearances in imperial chronicles. To understand what survived beyond conflict, the focus must move away from the clash itself and toward the systems of memory, knowledge, and continuity that did not require walls, writing, or conquest to endure across time. On the steppe, history was not something you left behind, it was something you carried. Without stone to engrave or paper to preserve, culture was stored in people, not places. Memory was not accidental or fragile. It was trained, repeated, and protected through use. Stories were told not to entertain idle time, but to prepare listeners for what lay ahead. A tale might describe a journey, but beneath the words were directions, warnings, and reminders. Songs followed the rhythm of movement, marking routes that returned year after year. Melody became map. Repetition ensured survival far more reliably than inscription ever could. Elders were not historians in the modern sense. They were living archives. Their value came from accumulated observation, not authority granted by position. They remembered winters that came early, summers that burned too long, rivers that vanished without warning. This knowledge was not abstract. It was practical memory, shared at the right moment and adjusted as conditions shifted. Children learned through listening and imitation. Identity was reinforced not by symbols carved in stone, but by participation in repeated acts. To remember was to belong. Forgetting was not error. It was risk. Because culture travelled with people, it left little for outsiders to find. When camps moved, nothing remained that demanded interpretation. When groups blended or were absorbed, memory dispersed quietly. No archive burned, no monument toppled. The record dissolved because the carriers of that record changed context. Later societies searching for origins found no ruins to question, no inscriptions to analyse. They mistook this absence for lack, never considering that history itself had moved on, intact but unrecognisable to their methods. This is why the steppe feels elusive. It offered no fixed reference points for future scholars to reconstruct. Its continuity depended on living practice rather than preservation. Once those practices ended or transformed, the record vanished with them. What remained was silence, but silence does not imply emptiness. It implies that the medium of memory was no longer present. Modern historians look for answers where answers never intended to stay. They dig for foundations where none were laid. They search collapsed walls for clues, unaware that the most complete histories were never meant to stand still long enough to crumble. Understanding this requires a shift in expectation. Memory can be a system, not a supplement. Oral transmission can be deliberate, not inferior. The steppe did not lack history. It lacked compatibility with tools designed to read permanence. What survived did so by movement, not preservation, and what disappeared did not fail. It completed its cycle. When people who carried memory were displaced or absorbed, their knowledge did not vanish violently. It thinned, scattered and reformed elsewhere, beyond recognition. This realization alters how disappearance is understood. Erasure does not always require destruction. Sometimes it happens through absorption so complete that distinction dissolves. A civilization that never wrote itself down cannot be erased in the usual sense. It can only become invisible, and invisibility leaves faint traces rather than ruins. With memory established as the true archive, attention can finally follow those traces. What remains are subtle marks, patterns beneath the surface, evidence not carved but embedded. To find them, history must change how it looks. That shift leads naturally to the next chapter, where archaeology begins, unintentionally, to uncover what silence has been carrying all along. Archaeology does not arrive with answers. It arrives with fragments, often overlooked, sometimes dismissed, and rarely dramatic. When early steppe societies began to surface in the soil, they did so quietly, a shallow depression where a camp once stood, a scatter of tools light enough to carry and easy to overlook. Soil layers subtly disturbed, then smoothed again by time and wind. To eyes trained on cities and tombs, these signs looked accidental. Civilizations, it was assumed, announced themselves loudly. They left walls, foundations, and weight behind. What appeared on the steppe seemed too thin to matter, too temporary to be intentional. Early archaeology carried the same expectations as written history. It searched for permanence. Dig sites were judged by density, by how much could be uncovered and displayed. When excavations across the grasslands produced only fragments, many researchers concluded that little had existed there to uncover. Camps that appeared and vanished with the seasons were catalogued as anomalies. Unusual burial patterns were treated as outliers rather than clues. Movement confused methods built to interpret stillness. What did not fit known categories was set aside, waiting for a framework that did not yet exist. Over time, repetition forced reconsideration. The same light traces appeared again and again across immense distances. Temporary camps followed seasonal rhythms that aligned with climate cycles. Tool designs repeated with small variations, optimized for transport rather than storage. Burial practices revealed consistency without monument. Individually, these signs seemed insignificant. Together, they formed patterns too precise to ignore. Archaeology did not uncover a lost empire. It encountered a different logic of presence, one that did not concentrate itself in a single place or moment. The realization unfolded slowly. The steppe had not been empty. It had been deliberately gentle. Minimal impact was not a limitation, but a method. These societies interacted with land in ways that resisted accumulation. They left what they did not need. They moved before exhaustion could take hold. The earth did not bear scars because damage had been avoided, not because activity had been absent. What archaeology first read as lack began to reveal restraint. This shift required a change in listening. Instead of asking where the buildings were, researchers began asking how movement-shaped material remains. Instead of expecting density, they traced rhythm. Patterns of return mattered more than permanence. Evidence stretched across landscapes rather than stacking in one place. Archaeology, once focused on recovering objects, had to learn to read absence, spacing, and repetition as meaningful data. Discovery came not as revelation, but as correction. What emerged was unsettling in its simplicity. The steppe left fewer traces not because it mattered less, but because it mastered how not to overwhelm its environment. Its people carried what they needed and released what they did not. The land absorbed their passing without collapse. Time erased camps, but patterns remained beneath the surface, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. Patience became the defining tool. Excavation widened beyond trenches and artifacts into landscape itself. Researchers learned to compare distance instead of density, absence instead of abundance. A single footprint mattered less than how often paths crossed the same ground. Over decades, this approach revealed intentional spacing rather than randomness. The land functioned as archive, storing behavior through repetition. What survived was not spectacle but pattern, not objects but rhythm. Reading the steppe required slowing down enough to notice consistency where silence seemed dominant. Overlooked signs quietly accumulated, meaning once expectations finally changed entirely there. Once these faint traces are recognized as intentional, the narrative shifts again. If life without monuments could still shape enduring patterns, then the most revealing evidence may not lie in tools or camps at all. It may rest in how these societies approach the one moment when movement paused by necessity. To understand that, attention turns toward the quiet rituals surrounding death, where memory briefly touched ground before moving on. Burial was one of the few moments when life on the steppe slowed enough to touch the ground. Movement paused, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. These graves were never meant to dominate the landscape. They did not rise upward or demand permanence. They rested lightly, placed with care, then left to weather and time. For societies built around motion, death was not an ending point, but a turning point. The body stayed briefly while the living continued forward. Burial became an anchor, only long enough to orient memory, not to trap it in stone forever or claim lasting authority. Across vast distances, burial practices repeated with quiet consistency. Bodies were positioned in similar ways, often aligned with sky and horizon rather than settlements. Grave goods were modest but deliberate, items tied to movement, survival, and identity. These sites were revisited, not to expand them, but to remember orientation. The emphasis was not on building a resting place for eternity, but on marking continuity. Life, movement, death, then movement again. This cycle mattered more than preservation, and belief was embedded in repetition rather than architecture. Memory travelled outward from these points across generations quietly, without demanding walls or monuments standing. Unlike pyramids or mausoleums, steppe graves did not seek to freeze time. They accepted change as natural. Wind moved across them. Grass returned. Markers softened. What mattered was placement, not scale. Burial sites functioned as memory points rather than sanctuaries, coordinates in a shared mental map. They reminded the living where they were, where they had been, and how cycles returned. In this way, death reinforced motion instead of interrupting it, anchoring belief without demanding permanence or attention. Even loss served continuity, rather than rupture across time for communities, always moving together through seasonal return and collective memory carefully maintained. Over time, archaeologists began noticing something unsettling. Burial customs once credited to later civilizations appeared earlier on the steppe. Orientation towards sky, inclusion of symbolic tools, careful treatment of the dead. These were not isolated coincidences. They appeared across regions long before monumental cultures claimed them as innovation. This suggests transmission rather than borrowing, ideas traveling through people rather than states. The steppe may not have received civilization as often assumed. It may have carried it, quietly and repeatedly, across open land. Influence moved faster than armies ever could, without ownership or borders, to slow history noticing its path fully. This realization requires care. It does not demand rewriting everything or elevating one culture above another. It simply widens perspective. Rituals do not belong to cities by default. Belief does not require buildings to spread. Shared human responses to death, memory, and meaning may have travelled first through open spaces where movement was normal. The steppe becomes less a receiver of ideas and more a corridor through which understanding flowed. Its role was not to claim, but to connect. Quiet transmission left few marks behind, yet shaped vast cultural continuity across continents and generations long before recognition ever arrived later. The tone here remains careful for a reason. Evidence suggests connection, not ownership. Influence does not imply origin in a single place. It implies movement and exchange over time. The steppe did not seek credit, and so credit bypassed it. Histories built around dominance overlooked pathways built around passage. Burial practices reveal this most clearly because they reflect belief carried inward rather than imposed outward. They whisper continuity where chronicles record conflict. Meaning endured quietly beyond written attention, waiting for slower forms of listening, to notice patterns already present beneath centuries of assumption and narrative habit, hard to unlearn today. With burial revealing shared belief rather than isolated custom, the question widens naturally. If these practices stretched across distances and outlasted individual groups, how far did they travel? What other ideas moved the same way, light enough to pass unseen, durable enough to remain? The steppe begins to resemble a network rather than a margin. To follow these paths further requires stepping beyond ritual and into circulation. The next traces are not found in graves, but along the invisible roads movement carved through land and time toward wider connection, that archaeology barely glimpses until patterns align quietly across regions again. Long before maps were drawn and routes fixed in ink, the steppe functioned as a network held together by movement itself. There were no paved roads, no mile markers, no borders to declare where travel should begin or end. Instead, paths emerged through repetition. Animals followed grass and water, people followed animals. Seasons traced invisible corridors across land, returning again and again with quiet reliability. These paths were not owned or named. They were remembered. Knowledge of them lived in bodies and stories rather than diagrams, allowing movement to continue without dependence on permanence or construction. Through this rhythm, the steppe became a corridor of exchange. Tools moved with families, techniques travelled with herders, materials passed from hand to hand across distances too large to imagine as connected from a settled perspective. Similar methods of horse management appear across thousands of miles. Wheeled transport emerges in variations without a clear inventor. Textile patterns repeat with subtle differences, as if adapted rather than copied. These similarities do not point to a single origin spreading outward. They suggest circulation, ideas moving continuously, shaped by use rather than declared ownership. The steppe functioned like a bloodstream, carrying nutrients where they were needed without ever announcing itself as a structure. Because movement itself was the infrastructure, it left little behind. No tolls were collected, no gates recorded passage. Exchange occurred through familiarity and trust, built over repeated encounters. Relationships mattered more than contracts. Timing mattered more than speed. Knowledge travelled light, carried by people who expected to keep moving. To later civilizations looking backward, this absence of fixed routes created the illusion of isolation. Innovations appeared separate, simply because the pathways connecting them were never frozen into stone. The reveal emerges gently when patterns align. Many later societies relied on these invisible networks without recognizing their source. Trade goods arrived without acknowledging the routes that delivered them. Skills appeared without reference to how they traveled. What was celebrated as isolated brilliance often rested on centuries of shared refinement carried across open land. The steppe did not compete for recognition. It facilitated connection. Its success depended on remaining unobtrusive. Influence moved more freely when it did not demand attribution. This reframing changes how connection itself is understood. Long-distance interaction did not begin with empires or trade roads guarded by soldiers. It began when humans learned to navigate uncertainty together. The steppe trained this capacity. It required cooperation across space, adaptation across cultures, and trust beyond immediate familiarity. To survive, people learned how to move information as carefully as they moved themselves. This skill became foundational, even as its origins faded from record. By the time formal trade routes were established, much of what travelled along them had already moved for generations through informal networks. The difference was visibility. Stone roads could be taxed, guarded, and remembered. Rhythms could not. As a result, history credited what could be controlled and ignored what simply worked. The steppe became background again, even as its patterns shape the flow of civilization quietly beneath formal structures. Understanding the steppe as infrastructure rather than emptiness clarifies its deeper role. It did not merely connect cultures, it taught humanity how to connect. Long before borders hardened, people learned how to interact across difference without centralized authority. That lesson persisted, embedded in systems that later forgot where it came from. And once settled civilizations realized how dependent they were on these moving networks, their response shifted. Reliance bred unease. Influence without control created tension. With movement established as the carrier of ideas, the story now turns toward how permanence reacted when it recognized its quiet dependence on what refused to stand still. As settled civilizations grew confident in their walls and records, they began to look outward and measure themselves against what lay beyond. The steppe reflected something unsettling back at them. It moved without permission. It survived without borders. It adapted without institutions. At first, this difference was merely unfamiliar. Over time, it became threatening. States built their identity around order, made visible, cities rising, laws written, authority centralized. The steppe offered a contrasting image, one that did not collapse under scrutiny, because it refused scrutiny altogether. Mobility endured without approval. Resilience appeared without hierarchy. To protect their sense of progress, early empires needed this alternative to feel incomplete rather than intentional. The language used to describe nomadic societies reveals this shift clearly. Texts began to emphasize formlessness, unpredictability, and danger. Myths cast movement as wildness, open land as void. These descriptions did not arise from careful observation, they arose from comparison. A way of life that could not be absorbed or ruled challenged the belief that settlement was the final stage of development. Rather than confront that challenge, empires reframed it. What could not be controlled was named chaotic. What could not be categorized was labeled primitive. Fear became explanation, and repetition turned that explanation into truth. Walls did more than defend cities. They structured thinking. Inside them, order felt natural. Outside, uncertainty gathered shape. Armies justified their presence by naming threats. Bureaucracies stabilized themselves by identifying what lay beyond regulation. In this environment, the steppe became useful as contrast. By framing mobility as danger, permanence felt safer. By portraying nomads as disordered, centralized authority felt necessary. The story did not need to be precise. It needed to reassure. Each retelling tightened the divide between inside and outside, us and them, stability and threat. The deeper discomfort was rarely acknowledged. The steppe demonstrated that life could persist without structures empires relied upon. That example could not be conquered easily because it did not present itself as a single target. There was no capital to seize, no archive to destroy, no border to secure permanently. Influence dissolved and reformed elsewhere. This resilience unsettled systems built on control. It suggested that dominance was not the only path to endurance. Rather than admit this possibility, empires pushed it away through narrative. Fear filled the gap left by uncertainty. Over time, this framing hardened into worldview. Civilization became defined not only by what it was, but by what it was not. Movement symbolized regression. Stillness symbolized advancement. These associations persist long after the conditions that produced them faded. Modern thinking continues to inherit this split, often unconsciously. Adaptability is praised only when it serves permanence. Mobility is celebrated only when regulated. Anything that exists outside formal systems still carries a trace of suspicion. This moment marks a turning point in the story. The steppe shifts from background to mirror. What empires saw reflected back was not chaos, but an alternative they could not absorb without changing themselves. To avoid that change, fear was chosen instead. Once fear entered the narrative, it did not remain abstract. It demanded response. And so the next phase begins, where discomfort transforms into strategy, and misunderstanding hardens into deliberate action designed to contain what could not be dismissed outright anymore. When fear alone proved insufficient, empires began to adapt. What could not be owned outright could still be used. The steppe posed a problem that walls could not solve, but it also offered solutions that permanence lacked. Mobility, endurance, and long-distance coordination were skills refined through generations of movement. Instead of attempting to destroy these abilities, settled powers learned to extract them. What followed was not erasure through fire, but assimilation through utility. Nomadic expertise entered imperial systems quietly. Horses were no longer just animals of movement, but instruments of power once reorganized under centralized command. Breeding practices refined on open land were adopted, documented, and standardized. Mobility tactics developed for survival across vast terrain were reclassified as military strategy. Long-distance logistics, once maintained through trust and repetition, were formalized into supply chains. Each step translated knowledge shaped by necessity into forms compatible with control. The source of that knowledge was rarely acknowledged. Function mattered more than origin. Leaders from steppe societies were sometimes recruited rather than resisted. Their understanding of terrain, timing, and coordination made them valuable. Once integrated, their skills became imperial assets. Their identities blurred. Techniques were renamed. Practices were recorded under new authorship. What had evolved through oral transmission and lived experience was rewritten as innovation. Over time, the rewritten version eclipsed the original. What was once adaptive knowledge carried by people became institutional knowledge claimed by states. This process felt peaceful on the surface. No cities burned, no monuments fell, yet something essential was lost. As steppe knowledge was absorbed, it was stripped of the worldview that produced it. Mobility became strategy, rather than lifestyle. Adaptability became tactic, rather than philosophy. The skills survived, but the system that gave them meaning dissolved. Influence remained, even as identity faded. History later celebrated imperial advancement, without recognizing the quiet inheritance beneath it. The reveal here is subtle and unsettling. The steppe did not vanish from history because it was defeated. It vanished because it was useful. What could be taken was taken. What could not be categorized was ignored. By the time these borrowed practices became foundational, their origins no longer mattered to those recording progress. The story of empire became self-contained, tracing its brilliance inward, rather than outward toward the networks that fed it. This kind of erasure leaves no ruins. It leaves familiarity without memory. Techniques feel native because they have been repeated long enough under a different name. The steppe becomes invisible not through rejection, but through success. Its ideas worked so well that they no longer appeared foreign. Assimilation replaced confrontation. Theft occurred without accusation because nothing visible was stolen. Only context disappeared. For audiences trained to associate erasure with destruction, this process is easy to miss, yet it is often more effective. People can be removed from narrative while their influence remains central. Names disappear while methods persist. Credit follows power rather than origin. In this way, empires preserved what they needed and discarded what challenged their identity. The steppe was not denied outright. It was rewritten until it no longer recognized itself in the record. This reframing changes how absence is understood. When a culture leaves no clear boundary between itself and what follows, it becomes difficult to locate. Its survival is diffused. Its memory is scattered across institutions that no longer reference it. What remains are techniques without lineage, innovations without ancestry. The steppe's presence became foundational and invisible at the same time. And this raises the next question, one history rarely asks. If steppe knowledge could survive through absorption, why did steppe identity not survive alongside it? Why were the ideas kept, but the people gradually forgotten? To answer that, attention must turn toward permanence itself, and how systems that rely on stability remember only what reinforces their own shape. There came a moment when the story of humanity became smaller, even as civilizations grew larger. It happened quietly, without declaration. Borders hardened, writing spread. Power learned to preserve itself through documents that fixed people to place and meaning to paper. What could be recorded began to matter more than what could be lived. In this narrowing frame, mobility, once humanity's default condition, slowly changed shape in the collective imagination. What had once been normal became suspicious. What had once been adaptive became unstable. As empires expanded, land transformed from shared environment into property. Space was divided, measured, owned. History followed the same path. Instead of cycles, it adopted lines. Instead of return, it celebrated ascent. Legitimacy became something that could be proven through records, inscriptions, and continuity of control. To exist meaningfully within this system, a society needed fixed points, capitals, borders, archives. Nomadic life, fluid by design, slipped between these requirements. It could not be easily plotted or paused long enough to be documented, and so it fell outside the narrative being written. This exclusion was not argued, it was assumed. The story of progress moved forward with settlement at its center. Mobility lingered only as prelude or obstacle, something humanity was meant to outgrow. One path was framed as advancement, the other as delay. Over time, this framing solidified into worldview. What stood still felt mature. What moved felt unfinished. The steppe did not disappear in this moment. It was relegated. It became background noise to a story that no longer had room for alternatives. The final shift here is not about power, but preference. Humanity chose permanence because permanence promised control. It promised predictability. It allowed accumulation, hierarchy, and memory to be stored outside the body. Adaptability, by contrast, required constant attention and adjustment. It left less behind to prove its value. Faced with these options, history favored what could be stabilized. The steppe represented a reminder that another way existed, one that resisted enclosure. That reminder grew uncomfortable, so it faded from focus. This narrowing did not eliminate movement, it reframed it. Migration became problem. Flexibility became weakness. Adaptation became something to manage rather than practice. The story simplified itself to move faster. What did not fit was left behind, still present, but unspoken. The steppe remained vast, inhabited, active, yet within the written record, it became silent. One path became history, the other became context. There is tension in this moment, not loss. What was set aside did not vanish. It waited. The choice humanity made was not final, only dominant. Permanence gained prestige, adaptability lost visibility. But visibility is not endurance. The steppe was excluded from the main narrative, yet its logic did not collapse. It continued to shape how people responded to uncertainty, how ideas traveled, how cultures survived pressure. It simply did so without acknowledgement. Seen from this distance, the disappearance of steppe societies from mainstream history aligns not with failure, but with divergence. Humanity selected a story that favored structure over motion, record over memory. That choice shaped centuries of thought, but it did not erase the alternative. It only removed it from the spotlight. The tension lies here, unresolved. If history narrowed once, it can widen again. What was pushed into the background may still be present beneath modern nations, myths, and identities, shaping behavior quietly, waiting for the moment when adaptability is needed, as much as permanence once was. That quiet persistence carries forward, setting the stage for what comes next, when the steppe's legacy begins to surface not as past, but as inheritance, still unfolding. The story does not end where the records fall silent. Bodies continued moving, even when names disappeared. Across the steppe, long before borders were imagined, people mixed constantly through proximity, necessity, and shared survival. Movement ensured contact. Contact ensured blending. These societies did not exist in isolation, drifting apart from the rest of humanity. They intersected repeatedly with farming communities at the edges of the grasslands, with river settlements, with emerging towns. Marriage followed trade, children followed movement. Over generations, distinctions softened. The steppe did not stand apart. It flowed into everything around it. This mixing did not happen through conquest or replacement. It happened quietly through seasons. Families joined and separated. Groups merged temporarily, then diverged again. Bloodlines crossed without announcement, without record, without concern for permanence. What mattered was continuity of life, not preservation of identity. Later populations across Eurasia inherited these crossings, not as a single traceable lineage, but as layered presence. The steppe appears in them not as marker or category, but as thread, woven repeatedly into different communities until it became indistinguishable from what followed. This complicates the familiar division between insiders and outsiders. The people later described as nomads did not remain perpetually other. Many settled, many blended. Many became ancestors of the very societies that would later define themselves against them. Fields were tilled by descendants of herders. Cities rose from land once crossed by families who moved with animals and seasons. Over time, memory shifted. Written histories favored permanence and minimized movement. The biological record, however, continued uninterrupted. Blood remembered what narrative forgot. The reveal here arrives softly. The steppe did not produce strangers who appeared and vanished. It produced people. Those people lived, adapted, settled, and contributed to everything that came after. The division between them and us was drawn later, by systems that needed clarity and boundaries. Biology never respected that division. It carried continuity forward, regardless of how stories were framed. The past remained present, even when language denied it. This perspective alters identity itself. Rather than fixed categories passed intact through time, identity becomes layered accumulation. Each generation carries traces of many worlds, not a single origin. The steppe exists within this layering, not as distant ancestry, but as repeated contribution. What appears absent in books remains quietly active in bodies. Movement ensured that no clear line separated nomadic from settled. The difference existed more in lifestyle than in lineage. This realization unsettles because it collapses distance. The steppe is no longer something external to observe. It is internal, embedded in populations that later imagined themselves separate from it. People whose descendants wrote histories that dismissed nomadic life were often writing about their own inherited past without recognition. The exclusion was narrative, not biological. Silence formed in texts, not in blood. Understanding this reframes inheritance. Continuity does not require visibility, it requires repetition. The steppe repeated itself through human connection rather than record. It passed forward through marriage, cooperation, and shared survival. Its legacy survived not because it was defended, but because it was lived. Over time, its presence became ordinary enough to go unnoticed. What feels familiar rarely draws attention to itself. This is why the story cannot end with disappearance. Erasure in narrative does not equal erasure in reality. The steppe endured through people who stopped calling themselves by any single name. They became farmers, traders, city dwellers. Their descendants inherited languages, customs, and beliefs that carried faint echoes of movement and adaptability. Identity thickened. Origins blurred. Once this is seen, the lens shifts again. If the steppe survived in blood despite being written out of history, then survival may extend beyond biology alone. The next question follows naturally, almost inevitably. Did this quiet inheritance also shape how people spoke, how they named the world, how meaning traveled alongside bodies across land and time? To answer that, attention turns from bloodlines to words, and from movement of people to movement of sound itself. Language travels differently when it is spoken rather than written. It bends, sheds weight, and adapts to the mouth that carries it. On the steppe, this quality mattered. Words needed to move as easily as people did. Sound could travel where objects could not. Memory preserved what paper never held. As steppe communities interacted with farming villages, river towns, and early settlements, language slipped quietly across boundaries. Words moved through trade, marriage, cooperation, and shared survival, carried not as formal instruction, but as habit. No treaty announced their arrival. No archive marked their path. They simply stayed because they were useful. Spoken language thrives in motion. It changes shape without losing function. Meanings stretch and compress. Sounds soften or sharpen depending on who speaks them. This made steppe-influenced words difficult to trace later because they did not arrive as complete systems. They arrived as fragments that blended into local speech. Terms related to animals, movement, kinship, and leadership traveled especially well because these concepts mattered everywhere. Over time, similar sounds emerged across distant regions, tied to similar ideas. The pattern does not point toward a single origin spreading outward. It suggests repeated contact across open land, words passing back and forth until they felt native wherever they settled. These similarities are easy to dismiss as coincidence when viewed in isolation. When viewed together, they form a quiet continuity. Across vast distances, certain sounds attach themselves to ideas of family, direction, authority, and motion. This repetition did not require conquest. It required familiarity. People met. They spoke. They borrowed what worked. Spoken language does not ask permission. It enters where there is use for it and remains where it fits. The steppe provided conditions where this process happened again and again, unrecorded, uninterrupted, and largely unnoticed by those later trying to reconstruct origin. There is something humbling in this realization. Many of the most ordinary words spoken today may carry traces of people who never wrote a line of history. Their influence does not announce itself. It persists invisibly, each time a sound is repeated without reflection. Language preserves continuity, even when identity shifts. As people settled, built cities, and formalized speech through writing, the spoken layer remained beneath the surface, carrying older rhythms forward. Written language froze certain forms. Spoken language continued evolving, carrying memory in a softer way. This endurance does not rely on permanence. Words survive because they are useful, not because they are preserved. A term that helps coordinate movement or clarify relationships spreads easily. Over time, it loses its sense of origin and becomes ordinary. The steppe disappears again, not because its influence faded, but because it blended too well to stand apart. Its language became part of daily speech, stripped of context, carried forward by people who no longer recognized where it came from. This pattern reinforces the same lessons seen elsewhere. What endures longest is not what is recorded, but what is repeated. Writing can preserve form, but repetition preserves function. The steppe relied on function. Its language traveled light, adapting to new environments without insisting on recognition. Each exchange reinforced continuity without ownership. Over generations, this made tracing origin difficult, but survival effortless. For late-night listeners, this realization lands gently. Speech becomes a kind of echo. Every conversation carries layers beneath it. Meaning does not belong entirely to the present moment. It is inherited, reshaped, and passed on unconsciously. When you speak, you may be repeating sounds that crossed open land thousands of years ago, carried by people whose names are lost, but whose voices remain embedded in the act itself. This is endurance without monument, influence without inscription. And language is only one layer. Words move freely, but ideas move even more easily. Belief, meaning, and worldview travel without sound at all, carried through behavior and story. If language preserved traces of the steppe, then belief may preserve something deeper still. With words carrying continuity forward, attention turns next toward how ideas themselves traveled, shaping understanding long after the people who first held them stopped being named. Belief on the steppe did not gather around stone or enclosure. It rose upward, outward, and forward, shaped by sky rather than structure. Open horizons made direction sacred. Cycles mattered more than commandments. The return of seasons carried meaning deeper than any fixed calendar. In this environment, spirituality did not demand stillness. It accompanied motion. Belief moved with people, adjusting as conditions changed, offering guidance without asking for permanence. There were no temples that required return, no idols that fixed attention in one place. Meaning was carried, not housed. These belief systems reflected the land that shaped them. The sky was ever-present, vast and uncontained, watching without walls. Its openness encouraged humility and awareness rather than dominance. Time unfolded in repetition instead of linear ascent. Storms returned, stars shifted, but remained dependable. Fate was not a rigid decree, but a current shaped by timing, choice, and balance. Spiritual life focused on orientation, knowing when to move, when to wait, when to yield. Wisdom was not about controlling outcomes, but about recognizing patterns and adjusting behavior accordingly. Because belief functioned as orientation rather than doctrine, it adapted easily. It did not require enforcement or record. It lived in habits, rituals, and shared understanding passed through practice. Children absorbed it through participation, not instruction. Elders refined it through observation rather than interpretation. In this way, belief remained flexible without dissolving. It offered coherence without rigidity. The steppe did not ask belief to explain the universe. It asked belief to help people live within it. As steppe communities interacted with settled societies, these spiritual ideas traveled alongside language and bloodlines. They left impressions rather than texts. Concepts of sky authority, journey, destiny, and return appear later across distant cultures, often treated as local innovation. Yet their structure reflects earlier conditions where movement was normal and change expected. The idea that power comes from above rather than within walls, that life unfolds as passage rather than possession, bears the mark of open land. These beliefs did not arrive whole. They blended, adapted, and settled into new contexts quietly. The reveal here is gentle but transformative. Many later belief systems inherited steppe ideas, then anchored them to fixed places. What was once guidance for movement became justification for permanence. Temples replaced horizon. Written doctrine replaced living orientation. The idea of cycles flattened into timelines. Beliefs that once prepared people to live within uncertainty were repurposed to stabilize authority. The core remained, but its application changed. Spirituality that had traveled freely was rooted, and in being rooted, it began to serve different ends. This does not imply loss or corruption. It reflects transformation. Belief changes shape as environments change. What mattered on open grasslands differed from what mattered inside cities. The steppe spiritual frameworks were not erased. They were translated. Their flexibility allowed survival, even as context shifted. What endured was not form, but function. Guidance remained even when expression changed. Meaning adjusted without breaking. For those listening quietly, this realization resonates beyond history. Belief does not need permanence to endure, it needs relevance. The steppe understood this deeply. Its spiritual life did not demand memory through monuments. It trusted repetition, orientation, and return. When people later settled, belief followed, altered but recognizable beneath layers of structure. The oldest ideas did not vanish, they adapted. This understanding prepares the next turn in the story. If belief systems designed for movement could survive by changing form, then the challenge was never movement itself. The challenge emerged when movement began to feel inconvenient, when change threatened stability, when adaptability became something to manage rather than embody. With belief carried forward, but reshaped, attention now turns toward the moment when motion itself was reframed as a problem. Civilization needed to solve, setting the stage for a deeper shift in how the world would be organized and understood. There was a moment when movement began to feel exhausting. As populations expanded and fields replaced forests, Survival started to depend on predictability. Crops needed timing. Property needed boundaries. Families planned not just for the coming season, but for generations tied to the same land. In this new arrangement, uncertainty became a threat rather than a condition. What could not be fixed in place felt increasingly dangerous. Adaptability, once essential, began to look like instability when permanence promised safety. Agriculture changed more than diet. It changed psychology. When food came from specific plots of land, movement risked loss. When wealth was stored in fields, tools, and buildings, leaving meant vulnerability. Borders emerged to protect investment. Ownership replaced stewardship. In this framework, nomadic life challenged everything that permanence relied on. People who moved freely ignored property lines. Groups that shifted seasonally disrupted planning. Their presence exposed how fragile fixed systems could be under pressure. Rather than adapt further, settled societies chose to narrow their world, reducing uncertainty by controlling space. This choice did not arrive as fear immediately, it arrived as preference. Stillness was easier to manage. Stability could be measured, taxed, and defended. Movement required constant attention. It demanded awareness rather than enforcement. Over time, the burden of adaptability felt heavier than the promise of control. What had once been normal was quietly reframed as problem. Motion became something to regulate. Wandering became something to prevent. Civilization began to define progress as the ability to stay in place without consequence. The reveal here is subtle because it turns inward. Humanity did not abandon mobility because it failed. It abandoned it because permanence felt safer. Safety became the new measure of success. Walls grew thicker. Records grew longer. Systems grew more complex. Each layer of stability reduced uncertainty, but also narrowed tolerance for change. Adaptability lost prestige. It survived only when necessary, treated as emergency rather than skill. This psychological shift reshaped values. Stillness came to represent order, maturity, and achievement. Movement took on negative meaning, associated with threat, loss, and unpredictability. Over generations, this framing hardened. People forgot that flexibility had once been strength. They inherited a world where change felt like interruption rather than rhythm. The steppe way of living, which accepted uncertainty as permanent, became increasingly incompatible with societies that promised control. Yet control carries its own anxiety. The more systems depend on fixed conditions, the more disruptive change becomes. Stability offers comfort, but it also creates fragility. When conditions shift, rigid systems strain. The steppe had never promised safety through stillness. It promised survival through awareness. That promise became less attractive in a world that preferred guarantees, even if those guarantees were temporary. The calm of permanence hides tension beneath it. The decision to hold on rather than adapt does not remove uncertainty. It delays response. Fear does not disappear. It is managed through structure, ritual, and narrative. Societies tell themselves stories that justify stillness as wisdom. Movement is portrayed as reckless. Adaptability is reframed as lack of commitment. Over time, these stories feel natural, unquestioned. For reflective listeners, this moment invites pause. Safety and wisdom are not always aligned. What feels secure in one era can become brittle in another. The preference for permanence solved immediate problems while creating long-term dependence on stability. Adaptability, once central, was pushed aside, not erased but marginalized. It waited in the background, practiced only by those forced to move. Once fear takes root, it seeks explanation. To manage anxiety, societies reshape the stories they tell about themselves. Movement must be explained away. Stillness must be praised. The next shift in the narrative follows this impulse. Fear does not remain private. It becomes story, myth, and moral lesson, shaping how humanity understands its past and imagines its future. Movement did not disappear when societies settled. It was rewritten. Stories slowly replaced observation. Where once mobility was understood as skill, it became symbol. Myths emerged that framed wandering as danger, exile, or trial. These stories did not describe nomadic life. They simplified it. Movement became a backdrop against which heroes proved worth. Gods delivered punishment, or order was restored. By turning motion into metaphor, settled cultures made it easier to manage emotionally. What had once required understanding could now be reduced to lesson, warning, or mythic obstacle, safely confined within narrative boundaries. Over time, these myths hardened into expectation. Nomadic figures appeared in legends as faceless masses or sudden forces, stripped of daily life. Their children, elders, and routines vanished from story. Only threat remained. This transformation did not occur accidentally. Myth allowed complexity to dissolve. It replaced living systems with symbols that could be defeated, avoided, or moralized. Once people existed primarily in stories, they no longer demanded explanation. They became convenient shapes that carried anxiety away from reality. This narrative safety mattered. By containing movement inside myth, settled societies reduced fear without changing behavior. Walls remained justified. Borders felt necessary. Control appeared virtuous. The steppe no longer needed to be engaged with directly, it could be referenced symbolically. Myth functioned as distance. It transformed unfamiliar neighbors into abstract challenges, rather than humans with alternative ways of living. The result was emotional clarity at the cost of understanding. The quiet reveal here is unsettling. Myth was not merely imagination or creativity, it was containment. By fixing mobile cultures into stories, they no longer had to be studied, negotiated with, or respected as systems. Myth froze movement into moral shape. It allowed settled societies to believe they had outgrown mobility, when in fact they had simply redefined it as past, test, or punishment. What could not be controlled physically was controlled narratively. As these stories spread, real memory thinned. Living knowledge gave way to inherited images. Children learned who nomads were without ever encountering them. Stereotype replaced observation. Over generations, myth felt safer than curiosity. It required no adaptation, only repetition. The more stories circulated, the less incentive there was to understand reality beyond them. Movement was now something that happened in tales, not something practiced or respected. This process deepened erasure without violence. No destruction was necessary. No culture had to fall. Reduction achieved the same result. By compressing complexity into symbol, societies convinced themselves that nothing essential was lost. The steppe faded from view while its image persisted, distorted and manageable. Myth replaced relationship, and with that replacement, accountability ended. Seen this way, mythology reveals as much about those who told the stories as those inside them. It soothed fear, justified control, and simplified difference. Yet something vital slipped away in the process. By turning adaptability into allegory, humanity lost direct contact with a skill it once depended on. The next question rises naturally from this loss. When movement became myth instead of practice, what vanished from human identity, and what quietly waited to return when certainty failed again? We rarely question these inherited frames because they arrive early and unchallenged. Myth settles into language, humor, and education. It feels neutral, even timeless. Yet beneath its smooth surface, it directs attention away from lived alternatives. What once taught resilience is reduced to cautionary tale. The steppe becomes warning rather than guide. In this transformation, humanity traded lived adaptability for narrative comfort, without noticing the exchange at the time. This narrowing of imagination prepared the ground for a deeper loss. When stories no longer reflected real ways of living, societies forgot how to recognize adaptability as strength. Movement survived only at the margins, practiced by those forced to change, rather than those choosing it. What was lost was not motion itself, but trust in it. And with that loss, humanity stepped further away from a skill that once shaped everything, setting the stage for questioning what happens when adaptability leaves the center entirely. It is there that the story pauses, asking quietly what parts of humanity were flattened into symbol, and whether myths still shape choices long after the land that inspired them faded from view entirely today. Adaptability once sat at the center of human life. It was not admired because it was dramatic, but because it worked. On open land, change was constant, and attention was survival. The steppe trained people to respond rather than resist, to notice before acting, to move before damage accumulated. Fixed systems came later, offering comfort through repetition. Laws, borders, and infrastructure promised stability by narrowing possibilities, turning motion into exception instead of norm. As permanence gained value, adaptability lost prestige. Systems designed to last required predictability. Roads followed lines. Schedules hardened. Success became measurable by what remained unchanged. The steppe's flexibility appeared inefficient by these standards. Why move when walls could be built? Why adjust when rules could be enforced? Over time, responsiveness was treated as weakness, a sign that planning had failed. Yet this judgment ignored context. Stability functioned best under stable conditions, while adaptability functioned everywhere else. Modern life reveals the tension left by that choice. When conditions shift quickly, fixed systems strain. Infrastructure cracks under pressure it was never meant to bear. Rules lag behind reality. Borders harden while movement accelerates. The feeling many experience is not simply chaos, but unfamiliarity with living inside uncertainty. The step never promised control. It trained awareness. Change was expected, not feared. Skills developed there emphasized timing, restraint, and cooperation across distance. These abilities are difficult to formalize, but effective when practiced. What history dismissed as early or incomplete may represent refinement in another direction. Adaptability does not produce monuments. It produces continuity. It leaves fewer artifacts because it leaves fewer mistakes to correct later. The steps approach did not resist change because resistance wastes energy. It adjusted early, moved lightly, and returned when conditions allowed. This reduced collapse by avoiding accumulation of stress. In contrast, fixed systems store stress until release becomes disruptive. This contrast unsettles because it reframes sophistication. Complexity and strength are often confused. A brittle structure can appear impressive until it fails. A flexible system looks plain until it survives. The step favored the latter, valuing responsiveness over display. Its people practiced living with uncertainty so thoroughly that uncertainty lost its threat. Over time, this skill was set aside, not disproven, but overshadowed by the comfort of control. No solution is offered here, only recognition. Adaptability cannot replace structure entirely, nor should it. But neglecting it leaves societies unbalanced. The skill that once carried humanity through unpredictable environments did not disappear. It became peripheral, activated only during crisis. When stability falters, people rediscover improvisation, cooperation, and mobility, often without understanding why these responses feel natural. The question lingers without answer. If adaptability was once central and is now marginal, what happens when conditions demand it again? Does the skill return easily, remembered in practice rather than theory? Or has reliance on permanence dulled attention beyond recovery? The step offers no instruction, only example. It demonstrates that survival does not always come from holding ground. Sometimes it comes from knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to let systems change shape without losing purpose. As the story turns forward, this unresolved tension follows, carrying ancient lessons into modern uncertainty, where brittleness is exposed and forgotten skills begin to surface again. It remains uncertain whether societies can relearn what they once practiced instinctively. Adaptability cannot be archived or commanded. It develops through exposure, humility, and repetition. The step did not teach through instruction, but through consequence, rewarding attentiveness and correcting excess quickly. Modern systems rarely allow such feedback without damage. Yet moments arise when rigidity loosens and improvisation returns. In these moments, people cooperate across difference, share resources, and move without permission. These behaviors feel temporary, but they reveal capacity. The skill set aside was never destroyed. It waits within responses, ready when conditions demand movement over certainty again. Quietly, they surface whenever pressure strips away, excess structure, and leaves attention, trust, and timing exposed again alone. There is no single moment when stability breaks. It thins first. Quiet signs appear where confidence once lived. Systems stretch further than intended. Supply chains grow longer, more fragile, dependent on conditions staying exactly as planned. Borders tighten, not because strength has increased, but because certainty has weakened. Environments shift faster than policies can adjust. None of this feels like collapse. It feels like strain. The kind that does not announce itself loudly, but accumulates beneath routines that once felt reliable. In this space of subtle instability, the step returns, not as land, but as pattern. The modern world begins to resemble conditions humanity once understood well. Movement resumes across every layer of life. People relocate more often. Work detaches from fixed locations. Identity becomes fluid, revised repeatedly rather than inherited intact. Even truth itself feels less anchored, moving through networks rather than institutions. What once seemed abnormal now becomes common. Change accelerates, and permanence struggles to keep pace. This resemblance is easy to miss because it does not arrive wrapped in history. It feels new, disruptive, overwhelming. Yet many of the behaviors now labeled as problems were once considered essential. Migration was adaptation. Improvisation was intelligence. Flexibility was survival. The discomfort people feel today does not come from change itself. It comes from forgetting how to live within it. Stability trained expectation. When expectation breaks, anxiety follows. The step never promised expectation, it trained attention instead. Ancient nomadic societies did not experience constant certainty. They experienced constant variation. Weather changed. Resources shifted. Alliances formed and dissolved. Rather than resisting this instability, they normalized it. Skills developed there emphasized responsiveness rather than control. When conditions changed, movement followed. When movement increased, coordination adjusted. Nothing was expected to stay still long enough to define identity permanently. That mindset now feels unfamiliar, not because it is obsolete, but because it was set aside too early. Modern anxiety begins to look less like fear of collapse and more like historical amnesia. The systems most trusted today were designed for predictable conditions. When those conditions shift, the systems strain and people feel disoriented. The sensation is often described as unprecedented. In reality, it echoes a much older rhythm. Humanity has lived inside uncertainty before. It adapted without catastrophe. What feels new is reliance on stability as default. This reframing softens panic without denying difficulty. The world is not necessarily falling apart. It may be returning to dynamics that once shaped human life more honestly. The Steppe way of living does not offer solutions, but it offers perspective. Change was never an interruption. It was the environment. The mistake was assuming that permanence could replace adaptability indefinitely. When that assumption weakens, familiar responses reemerge instinctively. People begin adjusting without instruction. They form temporary networks. They share resources informally. They move when opportunity shifts. These behaviors feel reactive, but they follow deep patterns. Under pressure, humans do not invent new responses. They recover old ones. Cooperation increases when systems fail to provide certainty. Improvisation returns when rules lag behind reality. Mobility becomes necessity rather than preference. These responses feel disruptive only because they conflict with expectations shaped by fixed systems. Seen this way, instability carries information. It reveals what skills have been neglected. It exposes the limits of structures built for a narrower range of conditions. The Steppe does not reappear as nostalgia or ideology. It emerges as reminder. Long before modern complexity, humans learned how to survive without guarantees. That knowledge did not vanish. It rested beneath layers of organization, waiting for conditions to demand its return. This recognition does not celebrate uncertainty. It reframes it. If modern life increasingly resembles the conditions ancient societies normalized, then discomfort becomes signal rather than failure. The rhythm feels unfamiliar because it was abandoned prematurely. Stability became central before adaptability could be integrated alongside it. The result is imbalance, not inevitability. As the world shifts, people begin adjusting intuitively, often without understanding why these responses feel right. Something familiar is returning, though it wears modern clothing. People move more often now, not always by choice, not always by crisis, but because staying put no longer guarantees stability. Homes become temporary. Work detaches from geography. Communities form quickly, then loosen, then reform elsewhere. Identity stretches across roles, locations, and timelines. To many, this feels experimental, even risky. Yet beneath the novelty lies an older pattern, one humanity has practiced before, long before screens and networks made movement visible again. Ancient steppe societies carried their lives with them. Tools were chosen for portability. Relationships were maintained across distance through rhythm and return. Memory traveled because it had to. Modern mobility echoes this logic. People today carry work, language, and social worlds inside devices rather than wagons. But the principle is similar. Life is organized around movement rather than place. What matters is access, timing, and connection, not permanent residence. The surface looks new. The structure beneath it is not. This resemblance is not meant to celebrate technology or condemn it. It is meant to notice recurrence. When conditions shift, humans reorganize in familiar ways. Temporary homes reduce risk. Flexible identities allow adjustment. Communities built on proximity rather than permanence lower the cost of change. Ancient mobility required these traits to survive ecological uncertainty. Modern mobility calls them back under economic, environmental, and cultural pressure. The impulse feels instinctive because it is. Many people living this way do not describe themselves as following tradition. They feel unanchored rather than historical. Yet the body remembers what the record does not. Adaptation does not require instruction. It emerges when circumstances demand it. The skills needed to live lightly were never erased. They were dormant. What feels like cultural experimentation may be subconscious inheritance, activated as stability thins. This inheritance does not arrive as wisdom or confidence. It arrives as unease paired with movement. Freedom mixed with disorientation. Choice shadowed by lack of root. Ancient mobility was not romantic. It carried risk, responsibility, and constant attention. The modern version feels similar. People move not because it is ideal, but because it is functional. Anchoring everything to a single place feels heavier than carrying it forward. Technology changes the scale, not the logic. Tools replace camps. Networks replace routes. Messages replace songs. The ability to coordinate across distance echoes earlier systems built on trust and repetition. Communities dissolve and reform around shared need rather than shared territory. Identity adapts to context. None of this guarantees fulfillment. It guarantees responsiveness. The Steppe did not promise comfort. It promised continuity through motion. Modern mobility offers the same uncertain trade. This parallel unsettles because it challenges the idea that progress moves in one direction. What appears as fragmentation may be redistribution. What feels like loss of route may be exchange of anchor. The ancient pattern was never about drifting aimlessly. It was about maintaining balance across changing conditions. Modern life recreates these conditions differently, but the response looks familiar. Carry less. Attach loosely. Stay aware. There is no judgment here. Neither nostalgia nor critique fits. Modern mobility is not a return to the past, nor an escape from it. It is recurrence. A pattern resurfacing because the environment invites it. When permanence falters, movement becomes sensible again. Humans do not need to remember this consciously to practice it. They respond with what works. For those living between places, this recognition offers perspective rather than solution. The sense of being unrooted is real. So is the sense of possibility. Both existed before. Ancient societies understood that belonging did not require stillness. It required relationship, memory, and timing. These elements can travel. They always have. The deeper question lingers quietly. If these patterns are resurfacing without instruction, what else is returning beneath awareness? Movement brings behaviors back first. Values follow later. When humans begin carrying their lives again, they may also begin carrying older ways of understanding change, responsibility, and balance. If ancient patterns are reappearing unconsciously, then the story has not reached its lesson yet. It is only preparing the ground for something deeper, something learned through motion, rather than explained through record, waiting to surface as conditions continue to shift again. Once uncertainty is seen as familiar rather than catastrophic, attention shifts again. The story moves away from systems and toward behavior. How people adapt unconsciously, how old patterns resurface without permission, how movement returns not as threat, but as function. This transition leads forward, toward the subtle ways. Humans are already relearning how to live inside change, even as they struggle to name what they are doing or where the impulse comes from. Some forms of knowledge depend on stillness. They assume conditions will remain stable long enough for rules to hold. Manuals, credentials, and plans work best when the world changes slowly. On the Steppe, that assumption never held. Conditions shifted constantly, and survival rewarded those who noticed first. Knowledge, though, was not abstract or hierarchical. It was situational, carried lightly, ready to change shape. What mattered was not what you knew, but how quickly you could sense difference and respond. Steppe societies trained this awareness from childhood. People learned to read land, weather, animals, and human behavior as moving systems. A change in wind direction mattered. The restlessness of herds mattered. The mood of neighboring groups mattered. No signal was too small to ignore. This intelligence did not sit in books or councils. It traveled through habit, practice, and attention. Knowledge existed to be used immediately, not preserved for authority. If it could not travel, it did not survive. This type of understanding looks fragile to fixed systems because it resists standardization. You cannot credential awareness. You cannot archive timing. Adaptive intelligence fades when removed from context, which makes it difficult to institutionalize. As civilization grew more complex, it favored knowledge that could be stored, measured, and transferred without motion. Rules replaced responsiveness. Plans replaced sensing. Expertise became something you held rather than something you practiced. The cost of this shift appears when conditions change faster than systems can adapt. Modern crises often expose this gap. Rigid frameworks struggle to respond to unpredictable pressure. Procedures fail when the situation does not resemble training. In contrast, people who sense early signals adjust quickly. They improvise, cooperate, and move resources where needed. These responses feel informal, even chaotic, yet they are effective. They resemble the intelligence that once sustained life on open land. The quiet reveal is that adaptability was never obsolete. It was sidelined because it does not fit neatly into structures of control. The Steppe did not vanish because it lacked relevance. It faded because its lessons resisted ownership. Awareness cannot be monopolized. Timing cannot be legislated. Flexibility does not scale. These traits function best through practice rather than hierarchy, which makes them difficult to reward in systems that value permanence. This creates a paradox. The knowledge most valuable in unstable conditions is the hardest to preserve through stable institutions. As long as certainty dominates, adaptability appears secondary. When certainty collapses, adaptability returns to center without announcement. People rely on intuition, shared observation, and rapid adjustment. They rediscover how to coordinate without instruction, how to trust signal over rule. These abilities feel improvised only because they have been neglected. The Steppe offers no doctrine here. It offers example. Knowledge mattered only insofar as it moved. It existed within motion and disappeared when frozen. This is why so little of it appears in formal history. You cannot excavate awareness easily. You can only witness its effects. When archaeologists find patterns of restraint and timing, they are seeing residue of intelligence that never meant to stay still. As adaptability re-emerges under modern pressure, the story turns inward. If this knowledge cannot be stored externally, it must be carried personally. It lives in attention, humility, and readiness to change. The Steppe trained these traits collectively. Modern individuals encounter them alone, often without language to describe what they are doing. Yet the impulse remains the same. When certainty disappears, knowledge that moves survives. And with that realization, the question shifts from systems to selves toward how forgotten wisdom might be carried forward again. It waits quietly, practiced in moments of response rather than reflection, returning when necessity strips excess away. Whether this wisdom can be sustained without crisis remains unknown. The Steppe answered through lived repetition. Modern life offers fewer chances to learn slowly. What returns may arrive unevenly, imperfectly, yet enough to carry life through changing ground again, under unfamiliar conditions ahead now. Remembering the Steppe does not mean rebuilding it. The conditions that produced nomadic life were precise, layered, and time-bound. Climate, animal migration, low population density, and open land combined to make movement practical, rather than symbolic. Those conditions cannot be recreated at will. To attempt imitation is to mistake result for cause. Early nomadic societies did not choose mobility as an identity. Mobility chose them because the land demanded it. Modern attempts to romanticize nomadic life often turn adaptation into costume. Temporary living becomes aesthetic. Movement becomes brand. What is lost in this translation is necessity. The Steppe was not freedom performed. It was responsibility practiced. Every decision carried consequence. Movement required restraint, coordination, and memory. To copy the surface without the pressure that shaped it is to misunderstand the system entirely. This misunderstanding matters because nostalgia flattens history. It suggests that wisdom lives in form rather than logic. The Steppe did not matter because people lived in tents or traveled with animals. It mattered because people learned how to think inside change without trying to stop it. The land forced constant adjustment, and adjustment sharpened attention. What survives from that experience is not a lifestyle, but a mindset oriented toward timing, balance, and awareness. Recreating form would miss essence. You can build wagons, but you cannot rebuild the ecological feedback that trained judgment. You can move frequently, but you cannot recreate the collective memory that guided restraint. What worked then emerged from conditions that corrected excess quickly. Modern life delays correction. It allows mistakes to accumulate behind systems. This difference changes behavior without consequence. Imitation becomes hollow. The grounding reveal here is simple. The Steppe is valuable not as model to copy, but as reference to understand limits. Its societies were not superior, they were aligned. When alignment broke, they adapted. When it returned, they returned. Their wisdom was proportional to context. To extract it, one must translate principle rather than repeat practice. This translation asks for humility. It resists the desire to revive what feels lost. Remembering does not require reenactment. It requires discernment. Which habits supported awareness? Which attitudes preserved balance? Which choices reduced harm by moving early instead of defending late? These questions apply now without requiring backward movement. By setting this boundary, the story avoids false solutions. The Steppe cannot be rebuilt physically, and it should not be. Trying to do so confuses longing with learning. What can be carried forward is subtler. Orientation instead of instruction, readiness instead of rigidity. Acceptance of uncertainty without surrender to chaos. This prepares a more mature integration. Lessons can guide behavior without replacing structure. Adaptability can live alongside stability if recognized as complementary rather than oppositional. The Steppe offers insight into how to think, not where to live. Once that distinction is clear, the next step becomes possible. If the land cannot be returned to, perhaps its logic can still inform choices made within modern complexity, shaping responses without nostalgia or denial. It encourages reflection rather than prescription. The step teaches restraint in claiming answers. It reminds listeners that context shapes wisdom, and wisdom shifts with context. By releasing the urge to copy outcomes, attention turns toward cultivating sensitivity, patience, and responsibility under present conditions. This approach honors the past without freezing it. It allows learning without imitation, memory without regression, and continuity without revival. From this grounded place, lessons become adaptable again, capable of guiding action without demanding allegiance to form. The next movement of the story follows this logic inward, asking how individuals can carry such orientation quietly, translating old awareness into modern choices without spectacle, certainty, or the need to announce return. It gently closes the door on imitation and opens space for reflection, preparing the listener to consider guidance rather than blueprint, attitude rather than artifact, and the quiet work of adaptation as something personal, practiced, and ongoing under shifting conditions yet to come. Orientation is not a map. It is the quiet ability to sense where you are while everything shifts around you. On the step, this mattered more than instruction. There were no fixed reference points that remained reliable long enough to anchor rules. Landmarks changed, seasons varied, groups moved. Survival depended on awareness rather than certainty, readiness rather than permanence. Orientation lived inside people, not outside them, and it traveled wherever they went. This legacy is difficult to notice because it does not announce itself. It does not look like law, monument, or tradition. It feels like calm attention under pressure, the ability to pause before reacting, the habit of scanning for subtle change. Steppe societies relied on this skill because external structure could not be trusted. Plans were provisional, decisions were reversible. What mattered was staying responsive without becoming reckless. This balance between movement and restraint shaped behavior more effectively than rigid rules ever could. Modern discomfort often begins when systems promise certainty and fail to deliver it. People are taught to trust structures that cannot bend. When those structures strain, confusion spreads. The unease is not caused by instability itself. It is caused by dependence on guarantees that never existed. The step mindset never offered such promises. It accepted uncertainty as permanent and trained people to live well inside it. Orientation does not reject structure entirely, it contextualizes it. Tools are useful until they become obstacles. Rules help until conditions change. The step treated structure as temporary aid, not identity. When a method stopped working, it was released without mourning. This flexibility reduced panic. Failure did not threaten selfhood because selfhood was not attached to fixed outcomes. Direction mattered more than destination. Carrying orientation forward does not require abandoning modern life. It asks for a shift in attention. Instead of seeking absolute plans, it encourages sensitivity to timing. Instead of enforcing control, it favors early adjustment. Awareness becomes primary. Systems become secondary. This inversion feels unsettling because it removes guarantees, yet it restores agency. When change is expected, response replaces resistance. The step's most enduring gift is this internal compass. It cannot be standardized or taught quickly. It develops through practice, humility, and exposure to variation. It is strengthened by listening rather than asserting. People who carry it move with conditions rather than against them. They recognize when to act and when to wait. They conserve energy by avoiding unnecessary defense. This skill does not eliminate uncertainty. It reduces harm caused by clinging to certainty. Listeners are not asked to adopt a new identity or philosophy. They are invited to notice orientation already at work. It appears when someone adjusts plans without resentment, when cooperation replaces competition under pressure, when restraint prevents escalation. These moments feel small, but they accumulate. They reflect intelligence, shaped by motion rather than instruction. With orientation established as transferable, the story loosens its grip on explanation. The final movement does not add new information. It withdraws, allowing reflection to settle. What remains is direction without demand, awareness without doctrine. The step does not insist on being followed. It offers a way of sensing that endures when structures fail. From here, the story is ready to conclude, not with answers but with stillness, carrying forward the quiet inheritance of attention into whatever uncertainty comes next. It does not promise comfort. Orientation rarely does. It offers clarity without illusion, movement without panic, and choice without force. In a world trained to wait for instruction, this quiet capacity feels unfamiliar. Yet it surfaces in moments of pressure, when excess falls away and what matters becomes obvious. The step did not teach answers. It taught questions worth asking. When to move, when to stay, when to release. Carrying orientation means accepting that guidance emerges through attention. not authority. It allows individuals to act without certainty, trusting timing over control. This inheritance does not belong to the past. It waits inside behavior, ready whenever systems loosen and listening replaces command. In that space, continuity persists without demand, and the story finds its ending by stepping aside, leaving awareness awake, receptive, and oriented within change, carrying forward direction rather than destination, prepared to meet whatever conditions arrive next, without fear. From a distance wide enough, disappearance looks different. What seems to vanish may simply disperse. Early steppe societies did not fall the way empires fall. They did not collapse into ruin or fade into myth alone. They loosened, they thinned. They passed forward into everything that followed without insisting on recognition. Their success was quiet. It required no monuments, no names carved to endure. By choosing movement over memory carved in stone, they ensured survival without needing to be remembered in the usual way. History continued, writing new chapters, naming new centers of power. Yet the pattern shaped on the steppe never left. It lived on in how people adapted when pressure rose, how cooperation emerged without instruction, how movement returned when certainty weakened. These responses did not announce their origin. They did not need to. They were practiced, not proclaimed. The steppe did not remain behind as a place. It moved forward as condition. This reframing alters the meaning of endurance. To last does not always mean to remain visible. Sometimes it means to dissolve so thoroughly into the fabric of life that separation becomes impossible. The steppe did not preserve itself through dominance or record. It preserved itself by becoming ordinary. Its logic merged into human response, shaping behavior whenever stability thinned. In this way, it avoided the fate of so many civilizations that demanded remembrance and collapsed when memory failed. There is an existential calm in this realization. The steppe was never meant to stand apart as a completed chapter. It did not seek legacy. It did not require explanation. It persisted because it did not resist change. When conditions shifted, it shifted. When pressure lifted, it returned in altered form. The choice to remain fluid protected it from erasure. What cannot be fixed cannot be fully destroyed. Seen this way, forgetting may not be failure, it may be design. A system that intends to endure across changing contexts cannot depend on recognition tied to a single era. The steppe released itself from that trap. By avoiding inscription, it avoided limitation. Its disappearance from history coincides with its greatest success. It became background to everything else, shaping responses rather than demanding attention. This reframing invites a different relationship with the past. Not everything that matters asks to be understood fully. Some patterns are meant to be lived rather than explained. The steppe survives in this manner. When certainty fails, people rediscover movement. When control weakens, adaptability returns. These moments feel spontaneous, even chaotic, yet they follow an old rhythm. The steppe does not announce itself in those moments. It simply functions. The documentary slows here because there is nothing left to prove. The story does not need conclusion. It opens into recognition. The steppe refused to end because ending would have required closure, definition, and fixation. Instead, it remained open. Its influence continued without boundary, slipping through bloodlines, language, belief, and behavior. History moved on, but the conditions that once shaped human life returned again and again, carrying the same quiet logic forward. This realization does not ask for revival or allegiance. It asks for stillness, for noticing how patterns repeat without explanation, for recognizing that disappearance can be a form of continuity. The steppe's presence today is subtle, not announced by geography or name, but felt in response to uncertainty. It emerges when structures loosen and attention sharpens. It appears whenever humans stop demanding certainty and start listening again. The story ends without resolution, because resolution would imply completion. The steppe never completed itself. It persisted as possibility. Its lesson is not instruction, but permission. Permission to move, to adapt, to release what no longer holds. In that sense, the civilization history never explained may never have wanted explanation. It wanted continuation. And it achieved that by refusing to end, dissolving into the rhythm of humanity itself, returning whenever conditions call for motion over monument, awareness over authority, and stillness over certainty. There is a moment when inquiry slows, not because answers are found, but because attention drifts. History does not announce this shift, it simply turns its gaze elsewhere. As states grow confident in their permanence, curiosity narrows. The need to question what lies beyond fixed systems fades. Early steppe societies slip from view at precisely this point, not erased in conflict but left behind by disinterest. Textbooks grow quieter. Timelines pass over vast stretches of land without pause. The silence that follows feels natural, as if nothing more needs to be said. This silence is not the result of resolution. It is the result of comfort. Once empires stabilized their borders and solidified their narratives, nomadic societies no longer posed immediate challenge. They were no longer unpredictable forces pressing at the edges of control. Without tension, curiosity weakened. Questions left unanswered were not pursued further. They were set aside, filed under irrelevance, assumed incomplete rather than essential. Absence became normal, and normality removed urgency. History favors what can be counted and governed. It rewards what stays long enough to be measured. When societies no longer interacted directly with the steppe on equal terms, the incentive to understand it diminished. The open land did not disappear, but it no longer disrupted the story being told. Attention settled on what could be ruled, taxed, and recorded. What moved freely fell outside the frame. Over time, this exclusion hardened into assumption. If nothing was written, nothing must have mattered. The quiet reveal here reframes this moment entirely. Forgetting was not failure. It was permission. The steppe did not resist misunderstanding, because resistance would have required the very permanence it avoided. To argue, to correct, to define itself against history would have meant stepping into the systems that could trap it. By remaining fluid, it escaped final classification. The silence that followed was not imposed alone. It was also chosen. This choice allowed the steppe to remain open. What cannot be fixed cannot be fully owned. What cannot be fully owned cannot be completely erased. The steppe slipped beyond the need for explanation, and in doing so, avoided being reduced to a single interpretation. History prefers conclusions. The steppe refused them. It did not ask to be remembered as empire or origin. It continued as pattern, behavior, and response, unburdened by narrative obligation. In this light, silence transforms from absence into shelter. It protected complexity from oversimplification. It preserved adaptability by avoiding inscription. While history moved on to other questions, the steppe remained active beneath awareness, shaping how people responded to uncertainty without demanding recognition. Forgetting allowed it to persist without distortion. This realization invites a different understanding of historical gaps. Not every silence hides loss. Some silences hold intention. When curiosity fades, it does not always mean nothing remains to be known. It may mean the subject no longer fits the questions being asked. The steppe outlived those questions by existing beyond them. As the narrative slows here, stillness replaces urgency. The absence of answers no longer feels incomplete. It feels deliberate. History stopped asking questions not because the steppe had nothing to offer, but because its offering could not be contained within the logic of permanence. Once silence is seen this way, it becomes meaningful rather than empty. And with that shift, attention changes again. Silence is no longer something to move past. It becomes something to listen to. Beneath it, patterns continue. Memory lingers without record. Meaning exists without summary. The next movement of the story does not rush to fill the quiet. It follows what remains within it, turning gently toward what silence still contains, and what has survived precisely because it was never fixed in words. Absence often feels like emptiness because we are trained to treat records as proof. What is written feels solid. What is missing feels lost. Yet history is shaped as much by what it omits as by what it preserves. Early steppe societies did not vanish into nothing. They receded into gaps that later cultures learned not to question. Those gaps became familiar, even comfortable. Attention moved on. Silence settled. Over time, absence stopped feeling like mystery and began feeling like resolution. But absence can hold weight. It can indicate not disappearance, but displacement beyond the tools used to observe it. The steppe did not leave fewer records because it lacked complexity. It left fewer records because its knowledge did not belong to fixed surfaces. Wisdom shaped for changing conditions resists inscription. Once written, it stiffens. It loses the ability to adjust without breaking. What works only in motion must remain mobile. The steppe understood this without naming it. Knowledge was carried where it could change shape without being damaged. Habit became archive. Instinct became instruction. Memory lived in bodies and behavior rather than shelves. This made it difficult for later historians to detect, but not because it was fragile, because it was active. Some forms of understanding survive only when they are practiced repeatedly, rather than preserved permanently. Once sealed into text, they risk losing relevance. The steppe favored learning that could be corrected quickly by reality. Error was visible. Adjustment followed. There was no delay between consequence and correction. This way of holding knowledge appears inefficient to systems built around permanence. It offers no certainty that can be stored or transmitted without context. It requires presence. It demands attention. It fades if neglected, yet strengthens when used. For societies dependent on stability, this seemed unreliable. so it was overlooked. The record favored what could sit still. What moved quietly remained unmarked. The reveal here arrives softly. Some knowledge survives longer by refusing preservation. Once recorded, it invites misuse. Written wisdom can be applied outside its proper context, long after conditions have changed. The Steppe avoided this by allowing knowledge to remain situational. It could not be invoked without presence. It could not be enforced without awareness. This protected it from fossilization. Reframing lost this way alters the meaning of history's gaps. What was not captured may not have been weaker than what was recorded. It may have been intentionally unanchored. The absence of text does not imply absence of meaning. It implies that meaning belonged elsewhere, in gesture, in timing, in response. The Steppe's intelligence left few artifacts, because it did not aim to outlast context. It aimed to function within it. This perspective reshapes how forgetting is understood. Loss is not always destruction. Sometimes it is release. Knowledge meant to live inside instability cannot be frozen without harm. The Steppe allowed understanding to remain adaptable by keeping it mobile. Its wisdom survived not through protection, but through repetition in lived experience. For reflective listeners, this realization softens the urge to recover everything. Not all wisdom asks to be retrieved. Some of it continues quietly, carried forward without acknowledgement. It surfaces in moments of decision when instinct overrides instruction, when timing matters more than rule, when cooperation emerges without planning. These responses are not new. They are remembered without memory. The weight of what was never recorded rests here, not in libraries or ruins, but in behavior that persists despite narrative absence. The Steppe's legacy does not demand recognition. It appears when systems fail to guide action quickly enough. It lives in habit, reflex, and shared understanding that emerges under pressure. Having explored silence as substance rather than void, the story turns inward. The question is no longer what was lost, but where it went. If knowledge survives through practice rather than preservation, then its traces may still be active. They may surface within human behavior itself, shaping response long before conscious thought arrives. What remains is not written, but lived. And it is there, beneath awareness, that the story continues. Beneath the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, something old awaits. It does not speak in dates or names. It does not belong to any single culture or era. It emerges quietly when certainty thins. In moments of pressure, humans do not pause to invent new ways of being. They fall back on patterns that feel instinctive, as if remembered rather than learned. Movement returns when staying becomes dangerous. Cooperation rises when hierarchy slows response. Flexibility appears without instruction, shaping behavior before explanation arrives. This is not innovation. It is recall. When conditions tighten, people migrate. They reorganize families, work, and identity with surprising speed. Certainty loosens its grip, replaced by attention to immediate signals. What matters is not long-term structure, but short-term survival, with minimal damage. These responses feel spontaneous, even chaotic, yet they follow a rhythm older than recorded history. They surface without permission, because they were never stored in language. They were stored in behavior. The Steppe lives here, not as geography, but as reflex. When pressure increases, the body remembers how to move. When systems strain, people rediscover how to coordinate without central instruction. Trust forms quickly under shared necessity. Resources are pooled. Roles shift. These reactions do not require belief or ideology. They occur before reasoning. The mind may explain them later, but the action comes first. This realization reframes human response to crisis entirely. What feels like breakdown may also be reversion, not backward, but deeper. The loosening of certainty allows older capacities to surface. The Steppe did not leave instructions behind. It left tendencies. These tendencies are not romantic. They are practical. They prioritize continuity over comfort, awareness over certainty. They are activated by pressure, not preference. Modern narratives often frame crisis as exception, as disruption of the normal order. Yet from a wider view, instability has been common for most of human existence. Periods of extended stability are recent and conditional. The behaviors that emerge under strain are not failures of modernity. They are reminders of a longer lineage of survival. The Steppe story did not end. It embedded itself in response. This is why the Steppe does not need to be explained to return. It does not rely on memory as story. It relies on memory as action. When environments shift, people move. When resources narrow, cooperation intensifies. When rules lag behind reality, improvisation fills the gap. These behaviors appear again and again across cultures, suggesting continuity beneath difference. The narrative layer changes. The response remains. The deeply personal reveal rests here. The steppe is not distant history, it is present capacity. It emerges whenever life demands attention rather than certainty. When adaptation feels natural and control feels heavy, something older is guiding choice. Instinct responds before language. The body understands what the story does not. This does not mean that crisis should be welcomed or idealized. It means that humanity carries within it the ability to respond without script. The steppe did not train people to seek uncertainty. It trained them to survive inside it. That training did not vanish when societies settled. It waited. As this chapter closes, urgency recedes. There is no call to action, no warning delivered with force, only recognition. The patterns beneath the narrative continue to function whether named or not. The steppe endures in these moments, not as symbol, but as memory expressed through behavior. It does not demand belief. It does not require explanation. This inward turn prepares for what comes next. When stories fall away, when explanation loosens, something quieter remains. The final movement of the documentary will not add meaning. It will subtract noise. It will let the story release its hold, allowing stillness to return. What remains after that is not instruction, but presence. The memory beneath the narrative does not need to be carried forward deliberately. It already is. There is a quiet urge at the end of every story to close it neatly, to assign meaning through resolution, to decide whether something succeeded or failed, rose or fell, mattered or disappeared. This habit feels natural because it reflects the way settled minds prefer to understand time. Lines move forward, chapters end, judgments follow. Yet some histories do not accept this structure. They resist being finished because finishing them would impose a verdict they were never designed to receive. Early steppe societies exist in this unresolved space, not because their story was interrupted, but because it never aimed for conclusion. They did not end. They did not collapse. They spread. Their continuity did not depend on remaining whole or visible. It depended on dissolving into new forms as conditions shifted. What looks like disappearance through the lens of finality appears different when viewed through continuity. Nothing stopped. Nothing closed. Movement simply carried life forward without pausing to mark an ending. The desire to complete the story belongs to cultures that measure meaning through permanence. Settled systems require closure because they build upon what came before. They need beginnings and endings to justify progress. The steppe did not require this logic. It did not need to prove its value to anyone else. It existed to function, not to be remembered as example or warning. To ask for its conclusion is to misunderstand its purpose. Letting the past remain unfinished is not an act of neglect. It is an act of accuracy. Some ways of living cannot be judged by outcomes because they were never oriented toward accumulation or legacy. The steppe did not chase permanence. It accepted change as default. In such a system, ending makes little sense. What would it mean to conclude something that adjusted continuously, rather than building toward a final state? This realization softens the need to explain everything. Not all histories ask to be summarized. Some ask to be acknowledged and then released. The urge to finish the steppe story comes from a worldview that equates meaning with closure. The steppe offers a different relationship with time, one where presence matters more than record, and continuity matters more than conclusion. As this final chapter opens, the pace slows deliberately. There is no climax left to reach. The narrative does not tighten, it loosens. The listener is invited to stop searching for the last piece that makes everything fit. Understanding does not increase by adding one more explanation. It deepens by allowing questions to remain open. The reveal here is gentle because it is internal. The steppe never needed an ending because it never needed justification. It did not exist to compete with other ways of living or to define itself against them. It existed because conditions shaped it, and it adapted in response. When those conditions changed too, nothing more was required. Releasing the need for conclusion changes the emotional tone of the story. Urgency fades. Comparison dissolves. There is no score to settle, no lesson to deliver sharply. What remains is calm recognition, a sense that something has been traced far enough to be felt rather than finished. This does not mean the past is irrelevant. It means its relevance does not depend on narrative completion. The steppe continues to matter precisely because it cannot be contained within a tidy arc. Its influence survives without needing summary. It operates beneath categories of success or failure, offering continuity rather than resolution. As the journey slows here, listening replaces analysis. The story is no longer pulling the listener forward, it is settling around them. Endings are released, not denied. The movement does not stop, it simply becomes less visible, less insistent. What began as exploration becomes acknowledgement. With the need for conclusion set aside, space opens for a different kind of meaning. not meaning defined through answers, but meaning felt through recognition. The next movement does not summarize what has been learned. It allows what has been noticed to rest, guiding attention toward presence rather than explanation, and toward a final quiet understanding that does not require being spoken aloud. Success is usually measured by what remains: stone walls, written laws, names carved deeply enough to resist time. History celebrates what announces itself loudly and lasts visibly. By that standard, early steppe societies appear to fail. They left few monuments, no enduring capitals, no centralized legacy that could be pointed to and admired. Yet this measure assumes that survival requires recognition. It assumes endurance must look like permanence. The steppe challenges that assumption quietly, without argument. What if survival without recognition is more enduring than domination with record? Empires rise by concentrating power, freezing hierarchy, and fixing identity to place. This strategy creates visibility and control, but it also creates vulnerability. When conditions shift, rigidity breaks, collapse follows. The steppe avoided this trap by never centralizing what needed to remain flexible. It did not monumentalize itself because monument becomes burden. It did not codify identity because codes resist change. Its form remained light enough to move when movement mattered. This choice was not defensive, it was practical. By remaining distributed, steppe societies reduced the risk of total failure. No single loss could end them. No capital could fall and take everything with it. Adaptability functioned as insurance. When pressure increased in one area, life shifted elsewhere. When resources thinned, relationships compensated. Survival did not depend on holding ground, but on letting go early enough to avoid collapse. The civilization's history praises most openly often ended abruptly. Their ruins remain as evidence of having been powerful, not of having endured. The steppe left fewer ruins because it left fewer points of failure. Its continuity did not require remembering itself as singular. It allowed blending, absorption, and transformation. Invisibility became strength. What could not be targeted could not be eliminated completely. This reframes disappearance as accomplishment rather than loss. The steppe dissolved into everything that followed. Its people became ancestors. Its language became ordinary speech. Its beliefs reshaped into new forms. Its behaviors resurfaced whenever conditions demanded them. Nothing needed to be preserved intact because continuity did not depend on identity remaining fixed. This is a different kind of success, one that avoids the cycle of rise and fall entirely. There is no triumph in this realization, only acceptance. The steppe did not outcompete empires. It outlasted them by refusing to compete on the same terms. It did not seek recognition because recognition binds survival to memory. Instead, it embedded itself in practice. What survives through use rather than record is harder to erase. It does not require agreement or admiration. It simply functions when needed. History's bias toward visibility obscures this form of endurance. We are trained to look for remnants, not for diffusion. When something spreads widely enough, it disappears from view. It becomes background. Yet background often carries the deepest influence. The steppe's disappearance from narrative coincides with its integration into humanity itself. It stopped being other and became ordinary. That ordinariness is its proof. By redefining success this way, familiar values loosen. Legacy does not require attention. Meaning does not require permanence. Survival does not require dominance. These inversions unsettle because they remove comfort from recognition. They suggest that what matters most may never be celebrated. The steppe offers no claim, no demand for acknowledgement. It demonstrates that persistence can be quiet, adaptive, and largely unseen. This understanding invites restraint in judgment. Not all civilizations aim to be remembered. Some aim to continue. Measuring them by visibility misunderstands their purpose. The steppe cannot be evaluated through the usual scales because it refused the conditions those scales require. Its disappearance is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of design. As this section settles, the narrative withdraws further. There is no final argument left to make. The inversion stands on its own. What lasts longest may be what does not insist on lasting. What survives deepest may be what blends so completely that it no longer appears separate. The steppe's success cannot be proven, only noticed, whenever human behavior shifts toward adaptability without instruction. That quiet persistence does not seek an ending. It does not ask to be remembered. It simply remains, carried forward wherever conditions, loosen, and continuity matters more than display. The story returns to silence, not as emptiness, but as presence. What once felt like absence now feels wide and patient. holding everything that was traced and everything that was left untouched. Dates loosen their grip. Names fade. Explanation steps back. The step no longer appears as subject or location, but as sensation, open and unfinished, without edges that require definition. This stillness is not the end of knowing. It is the space where knowing no longer insists on shape. In this quiet, the urge to conclude dissolves. There is nothing left to prove, no lesson to extract, no resolution to secure. The step does not ask to be remembered through effort. It does not demand application or revival. It rests as orientation, a subtle awareness that history extends far beyond what survives on the page. What was followed here does not arrive at summary. It settles into recognition without words. Silence changes when it is understood. It becomes holding rather than hollow. The vast grasslands that once seemed empty now feel full of movement paused only briefly. The people who passed through them are no longer missing. They are everywhere, diffused into habits, responses, and rhythms that continue without attribution. The step does not stand apart from the present. It folds into it gently, without announcement. What disappears from record does not vanish from life. It reappears in timing, in restraint, in cooperation that arises without instruction. It surfaces when attention sharpens under pressure and certainty loosens its hold. These moments do not feel historical. They feel natural. That is the point. The step survives by feeling ordinary, by blending so completely into human response that it no longer needs to be named. This ending does not offer closure because closure would narrow what remains open. The step's endurance rests in its refusal to be finalized. It exists in return rather than conclusion. When conditions change, familiar responses emerge again. When stability strains, adaptability answers quietly. No one announces this return. It happens because it has happened before. Rest arrives here, not as forgetting, but as release. There is permission to stop reaching backward for certainty, or forward for application. The story has done what it needed to do by loosening attention, rather than tightening it. What remains is calm awareness, a sense that history is larger, softer, and less finished than it appears. Nothing needs to be carried deliberately from this moment. Orientation remains whether noticed or not. It lives beneath thought, ready when movement is required again. The step does not linger as image, it lingers as capacity. It does not ask to be honored. It waits patiently in silence that holds memory without demanding recall. As the narration fades, nothing resolves, it rests. The open land stretches without horizon. Movement pauses but does not stop. The listener is not directed anywhere. They are left where they already are, with awareness widened slightly, listening differently to what once felt like absence. What if nothing was ever lost? What if it was only released from record, allowed to move without being watched? In that possibility, the step remains unfinished, and so does the story. It does not close. It opens into stillness, where rhythm replaces explanation, response replaces certainty, and return replaces ending. Silence remains not empty, but alive, carrying what persists without asking to be held.